When you think of the word communication, what comes to mind? I'd be willing to bet that the vast majority of people who hear the word communication would think about verbal communication. In other words, the words and the sentences that we speak to each other out loud. However, communication is a lot more complex than just verbal. There's nonverbal, which can be any number of factors such as body language, and even the social context in which we find ourselves and communicate with can also be considered communication, not even to mention digital communication, which is a whole other ballgame. Communication of all sorts can be looked at as a web, something complex, complicated, and not easy to decipher. One of the threads in the web of communication is gender. Gender influences the way that we communicate with one another in very diverse and distinct ways. And it's important that if we're going to understand how to better communicate both with those of the same gender and those of the opposite gender, that we understand how it impacts this web of communication. Today, I will be speaking briefly about 3 aspects of communication that are influenced by gender, or rather 3 aspects of gender that influence the way that we communicate with other people. Firstly, I will be speaking about power dynamics within relationships and what that has to do with gender and communication. Second, I'll be talking about societal norms, biases, and expectations with gender, how that impacts communication. And last but not least, I'll be speaking about gender roles and how that influences the way that we communicate, both verbally and non-verbally. According to the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, power is a social construct that is pervasive in everyday interactions and relationships. According to the same journal, in most relationships, the men tend to have more power within relationships. This is because of something called positional power. In other words, to make that a little bit the definition short, I guess, positional power really just means the power that someone brings to a relationship because of the socioeconomic status. In other words, how much money somebody brings into a relationship. In most relationships, men, at least in heteronormative relationships, men on average tend to bring in more money to a relationship, so they have more positional power. So how does this translate into communication? First, the person with more positional power, or the man, will often have more of a say in what the couple may or may not do, what they spend their money on, what they spend their time on, and such. This puts the woman in a difficult position because her voice isn't heard as much, simply because she might not make as much money. This is something that happens without even thinking about it. It's just an innate thing that humans tend to do. This situation is changing in a lot of relationships because more and more women are starting to go to college and pursue careers rather than taking the more traditional way and staying home with children. And so this positional power is starting to shift and we're seeing more equality, but it's still important to note that the power role usually is held by the male in a relationship. Second, societal norms, expectations, and biases. For this, I want to talk about the societal norms and expectations of appearance. According to a study done in Finland, it was found that Finnish women spent on average 30 more minutes than their male counterparts getting ready each day, and that these women cared more about what they looked like, especially to their peers, not only in person, but on social media. When taking selfies, they took on average 10 times more selfies than the average male would during the day, and they posted twice as much as males would during the day. But what does this appearance-driven need phenomenon illustrate? Well, according to this study, it leads to something called the, quote, feminine burden of perfection. This feminine burden of perfection simply means that society puts so much value on a woman based on her appearance that it is detrimental to her if she does not fit into a box of the perfect perfection. If you will, this nonverbal communication, what we communicate through the way that we dress and groom, becomes more important than what we're actually speaking or bringing to the table. And that can be really detrimental to women, to their place at home, in the workforce, just in society in general, because overemphasized is the physical side of things, and that affects the way that people view one's ideas. For example, if a woman is overweight, she is less likely to get a job or be taken seriously as a person just because she doesn't fit into the ideal body type. Lastly, gender roles and communication. Traditional gender roles, we all know them. Men more likely are to be brave and strong and to go out and earn money for the family. And the traditional gender roles for women is for them to be kind and caring and nurturing, stay home with the children. As I mentioned earlier, with more and more women going and getting an education and choosing to pursue careers, the gender roles are starting to change, but tradition is still tradition and demands to be heard and seen. Because of this, the traditional gender roles within relationships continue to cause problems, if you will, especially among couples where both are working, at least in communication. An example of this is something called, quote, the second shift. When we're talking about the second shift, it basically means that because of traditional gender roles and how it's expected that women are to stay home to do cooking and cleaning and those kinds of things, although both members of a relationship may be working, the woman is more likely to come home and be expected to take care of the kids and other household things, even though she's been at work just as much as the man, if not more. Essentially, this expectation is an aspect of communication where women are just expected to do it all. Once again, I find it really interesting. I reflect on my own relationship, and my husband and I, we both go to school, we both work, but I do see aspects of this even in our own relationship where I tend to do maybe a little bit more cooking than he does, or I clean the house more than he does. I don't think it's anything conscious that we do. We've never articulated what we want the division of labor in our house to be. We both help out, but I've noticed that sometimes I do help out more with those bigger household things. And I think that is an aspect of communication, gender roles in society, and I guess how we just expect and communicate those expectations to be in a relationship. This can cause problems though, because women feel that they are doing more than men. Men are cut off from helping out at home, and if it starts this way, then it's more likely that as men get older, they become less and less attached to housework and do less and less around the house, which can cause larger conflicts in relationships if not communicated well. Obviously, the threads of gender and communication are more extensive and woven than the examples that I've given. I was just hoping to bring your attention to a couple of things that men and women may view differently and that may cause conflict within communication. I think it's important. We all are communicating with people of different genders and even no genders every day. So it's important to understand how, I guess, the unique social norms and biases and roles and power in relationships can play into the way that we communicate with those of different genders or even the same gender as ourselves.